Shakespeare is the foundation of a lot of modern literary, not just concepts, but as far as literary ideas, and just the fact that when in terms of writing, I mean, we use the term genius so often, but I think in this case it's definitely aptly applied. I mean, Shakespeare was a genius in terms of writing for his day. And so it's hard to understand now because a lot of the language has fallen out of use and it's considered archaic. But in terms of concepts and the big picture, it doesn't get better than that. Even to the point that a lot of his plot lines are used in modern movies and people don't even realize it till they go, hey, wait a minute, that's the same thing that happened in whatever movie it was. Well, that's because they used the same story as their base idea. So, and I think it's important. Plus, there's just something to be said for exposure to great things. Of Shakespeare's plays, this is the easiest one to understand. It's the easiest one to explain. It's the most accessible in terms of plot and story. Most American high schools, you tend to work on four plays. You're going to have Romeo and Juliet, you'll have Julius Caesar, you'll have Macbeth, and possibly Hamlet. Hamlet is too complex in the case of the story to really be accessible to anything less than seniors. Macbeth tends to be a bit violent. Also tends to be a bit complex in terms of plot structure. So it is usually juniors or seniors that read it, and probably not lower than that. Julius Caesar has too much political intrigue and can kind of be hard to follow because of all the characters. Romeo and Juliet's probably the simplest plot. It's the best example, the easiest example of what a tragedy is, what a five-act play looks like. And really, for the most part, I mean, if students tend to remember any play that they learned, it's either Romeo and Juliet or they remember Hamlet, depending on how much they got out of either. That Mercutio is supposed to be a foil to Romeo. Romeo's impulsive, but he's not necessarily impulsive, he's impractical. Mer- Mercutio is impulsive. I mean, he just acts on impulse and that's it. Uh, and when Romeo does act more like Mercutio, the consequences tend to be severe. Uh, you know, he decides to get married to Juliet and not tell anybody. He decides to seek revenge, or at least uh, try to get back at Tybalt for killing Mercutio. And again, it comes to a tragic end. And then he doesn't really wait to hear from the friar or see what all was going on when he finds out that Juliet died. So every time he acts like Mercutio, it tends to not end well for him. And so it was kind of Shakespeare's way of saying, hey, when you act on impulse, bad things can happen. The play's about religion. Shakespeare lived at a time in which, depending on what your belief was, it could land you in jail, it could land you on the headsman's block. And one theory that we discussed in a Shakespeare course that I took in college is that at the time Shakespeare wrote his plays, he was a Roman Catholic at a time in which being a Roman Catholic would get you executed for treason. And so the religious wars that were going on, not only in England, but also in Europe in general, could have been avoided if religious people acted like men of God rather than men of politics. And so when the friar, who should act like a man of God, acts like a man of politics, trying to broker the peace between the families, things unravel, and they unravel pretty drastically. Had the friar being ended up being the most pivotal character, had the friar acted like a friar, the entire tragedy could have easily been avoided. Yeah, it would have sucked for Romeo and Juliet, but he's making a statement that's difficult to that was difficult to make at the time because again, this is life or death situation, and something that I always tell my students: if you want to know what our society thinks of a culture or a society from the past, then you study history. If you want to know what that culture and that society thought of themselves, you study their art and literature because that's where you're going to find out. Art and literature are the key, and so this is a playwright making a political statement. Now, he was also trying to make a buck, so it had to be entertaining. I mean, the man did do this for a living. But some of his plays were very, very political in nature, but subtle in their political statements. So this is, again, that's just one theory. There are several, but it was one that always intrigued me because I could, studying the history of the period, I could definitely see it. It's Shakespeare, and while some people don't necessarily, they tend to think of Shakespeare as boring, I would say give it a chance because I doubt this is the vision that you have in your head of Romeo and Juliet. And so I've encouraged all of my students because we've watched two different versions of the movie. One is a very traditional adaptation, and the other is, it's the way I explained it. One is what most people think Shakespeare is, the other is what Shakespeare can be. And I would say that the reason you should come see this is because this is what Shakespeare can be, rather than what most people think it is.